Thanks, buddy. Appreciate that. All right. We don't normally do a Robert's rules, but I'll take silence as assent that there aren't any changes to propose to that. So at this time, I will ask if there's any public comment, and we try to focus our first public comment on things that are coming up in the agenda items. We'll have another opportunity to comment at the end of the agenda on any topic, but right now we'd like to stick to agenda items if there's any public comment. All right, I am hearing none, seeing none, checking the chat here. All right.
Laura, this
yes.
is Jim. Just a quick editorial note. The meeting is being recorded. I was a little late hitting the start button, but we're rolling.
That's all right. All right. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. So everybody, so that you are aware, the meeting's being recorded. All of these meetings are posted on the Water Use Advisory Council's website if you ever just have a real need to go back in and listen to everything. So thanks for your patience on that. We'll go ahead and start right in because we've got a pretty full agenda today. And we will start with the Data Collection Committee and ask for you folks to go through the recommendations that you've gotten. And just for everybody's information and knowledge, what we're going to do is we're going to allow each committee to get through the list of their recommendations. Because a lot of these recommendations tend to be very dependent on each other. So we're going to let them get through their whole list of recommendations, talk about and talk about those as they need to. Then at that time, we're going to ask for questions, answers, and we're going to basically take a temperature of how people feel about those recommendations. If you have concerns, if you if you don't feel comfortable with a recommendation or don't think that in its current form it's ready to be part of the report that we're going to submit to the legislature, you don't have to give all kinds of explanation about why you think that. Just let us know that you're uncomfortable with it so that we have the opportunity to let those committees then continue to work with you to address the concerns that you've got. We just want to see where people are before we move too much further in getting these report recommendations done. So again, you don't have to do a whole lot of explanation. You can just say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. We need to work on this some more. And we'll be making notes of it along the way so that those committees can get back in touch with you and answer questions or address concerns so that we can bring those back then to the full council at our next meeting. Any questions about that before we roll in? Okay, in that case, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and Brian, you can start us through the data committee, and Tom.
All right. Welcome everybody. It's nice to present to you. I'm just going to give you a quick overview, and then I have helpers to get through the data committee recommendations today. So if you're one of my co-presenters, get queued up and ready as we move through this pretty quick. The data committee basically started out by taking a look at all of the previous recommendations and took responsibility for really doing the full account of where we were at implementing each one of those, whether they were completed, needed work, and how much. As we did that, and as you'll see in our presentation, we found that most of them were able to be clustered into a couple of categories. And those ones that you're going to see here today are the water management data framework development, new data acquisition, issues of data collection standards and protocols and data use protocols. We had inland lakes ARIs. We had a couple about well drillers and trainings and kind of well driller, well owner recommendations. And then there were a couple that we also passed off to the models committee. And then there were a few more recommendations under the inland lakes ARIs that are not relevant until we accomplish the first couple under that heading. So that's sort of your accounting from us that we thoroughly scanned through all of the previous Water Council's recommendations. So at this point, we're going to dig into the first one, and if Dave Hamilton is queued up, he's going to tell you about our vision for the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Dave, before you start, this is Jim Mel again. We're picking up some background noise, so we'd appreciate it if you're not making a presentation, if you please mute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk about the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database. And the idea here is that there's a lot of data that exists for water, both water quantity, water quality, geologic information around the state. But it's not a complete amount of data that we need. So we're kind of breaking this up into several different elements. So one is, first we're going to try to identify where there's a lot of data that's available, but it's been compartmentalized. It exists a lot of different places. And we like to pull that together into what we're calling the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database. So this will pull together existing data of various forms. So it will include surface water, quantity and quality, groundwater, water levels, and water quality, as well as geologic data dealing with stratigraphy. Some of these databases just need to be linked together. Others actually need to be transformed. They're not in a form that makes them readily accessible. So this whole thing would be pulled together and called the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database. There's also other important issues that we're dealing with. One is the Michigan Hydrologic Framework, which I'll talk about in another section. But the idea of that is focused on models, but it also recognizes the need for data. And it provides a framework which data can be housed and made accessible. So this may be a way that we want to either house the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database in it, or at the very least, we will link it to that. And there's a lot of data that will become available through this Michigan Hydrologic Framework. Another thing where there's a need is that there's a lot of data that exists in paper files only. And that needs to be transformed into something that's usable digitally and put into databases. And then the final category is the collection of new data. And there's calls for that in another recommendation from this committee, as well as recommendations out of the Michigan Hydrologic Framework. And we need to make sure that there are ways that any new data comes in, falls into these formats, and becomes readily accessible. The recommendation from this portion is for $170,000. It would be spent over 2 fiscal years, and that would be to create the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database. That's not all of the things that I've talked about, but this would create that integrated database function. So I will stop there. We're going to take questions later, I believe, right, Brian?
Yeah, we're going to try to hold questions until after presenting each one.
Okay, I'm done then. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. All right, new data acquisition. So underlying pretty much almost this whole entire program is that we're trying to accurately represent the conditions in Michigan. And in order to do that, we need high quality data. And so in general, this new data acquisition encompassed a lot of the previous recommendations. And when we speak about new data, generally speaking about 3 categories: stream flow, groundwater, and geology data. And at a high level, none of those data types are in a very satisfactory abundance, according to anybody that we know. In order to get it to where we need to be to really do the kind of job managing our water that we want to do, it will require a very long-term strategy and investments. And so we recognize pretty quickly we are not going to in one fell swoop catch us up to where we need to be for data, but we need to be thinking about the long-term strategy, and we also need to be making some strides in the short term. Let's go ahead and forward a slide for me, Jim, please. Okay, so you'll see several pieces of recommendations underneath new data acquisition. The first one that we're proposing is really to accomplish this very comprehensive and long-term planning for data acquisition. And I will read what we have here. It's that we recommend that we coordinate development of an overall long-term plan for the acquisition of water management data needs. This entails formal analysis and communication of all forms of existing stream flow, groundwater, and geological data by type and locations in Michigan, identification of critical data gaps and needs, and development of priority needs and cost-efficient strategies for data collection. So again, this may tie in a little bit with the work to be done on the database, but we do wish that we, in a very robust professional management framework, take account of all of the data that we have and identify the most pressing gaps, and do that for each of our types of data. And each one of those three categories has a lot of differences in how you can collect the data within it. And so this will largely be work that the Water Council Data Committee continues to be very involved in and work to forward, but we also need some extra financial resources to pull this off. There's a lot of technical, statistical, and IT components to it. So we've estimated that could be about $100,000 of financial investment needed to really complete this, and that we would do it over about 2 years. It would be nice to get it done by the next formal official report. So that's what this one is targeting. You can go ahead and advance to the next. For stream flow data types, I'll just say this in a more general way. Nobody's very happy with the amount of stream flow data collection that we have in Michigan. We typically do stream gauges that are permanent, fixed, or we do miscellaneous measurements. And in both regards, we don't have the type of data network that anybody would hope for. We would like to ask for more to expand the effort, but we actually realize that by the fiscal year 2022 budget, the existing source of funding that Eagle has used to fund the modest existing level will disappear and will not be a usable form. So the recommendation coming from our committee now is not for some wonderful expansion of the program. It is to seek a replacement for the existing modest level of stream flow data collection. And our estimate right now is that that's about $350,000 a year total. Okay. Please advance one more. I think Ralph Hefner should be queued up for the next one. Jim, are you able to advance the slide, Jim?
I'm on the groundwater slide right now.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Ralph Hefner with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I've been tasked to deliver the message about the groundwater monitoring in the state of Michigan. As you may recall, if you've been around with water resources in Michigan for a long time, we used to have a groundwater network that was basically halted in the late 80s, early 90s because of funding limitations. But right now, our monitoring well network is inadequate throughout the state. There's only a handful of wells that are totally dedicated towards monitoring long-term groundwater levels, looking at trends, looking at water quantity throughout the state. Our recommended actions are to implement a plan for a more comprehensive network throughout the state. And we hope to do this through a four-tiered approach with initial evaluation that would be done in conjunction with some of the previous things that both Dave and Brian mentioned. Field evaluation, basically trying to find existing wells and determining whether new wells need to be drilled or installed. Actually implementing the network and whether we want real-time wells or whether we want wells with data loggers on them that we only download on a quarterly basis or on a regular basis. And then operation and maintenance, which would go on for the duration of the program. The number of monitoring wells is to be decided during that initial evaluation stage. But initially, if we estimate approximately 2 per county, that would, times 83, that would give us 160 to 170 wells throughout the state. We also recommend that Eagle join the National Groundwater Monitoring Network. This is a national network where people or different agencies are given the opportunity to share their data on a national level. And it does not require any changes or updates to the existing data structure or format. Rather, it provides a translator, more or less, that takes existing data and puts it into a single format that's accessible throughout the nation. putting our data that we would collect through either Eagle or through USGS or any other agency available to everybody in a single comprehensive database. The overall cost to the monitoring well network itself for implementation is $259,000 during the first year, and then $226,000 in subsequent years, subject to cost increases because of inflation. But yeah, you may know that the USGS also has a match program called the Cooperative Match Funds Program, which is subject to availability. We already match a lot of the stream gauging activities throughout the state, so the prices that, or the numbers that you see there, can actually be lowered by federal matching funds. USGS would be implementing this work, and the time frame, our program could start immediately, subject to approval and funding, and those annual costs for operation would continue for the life of the program. That's it. Thank you.
All right, Dave Lush, if you're there, would you cover our 3D glacial aquifer mapping in 4 Michigan counties?
Sure. Hello, everybody. This recommendation is entitled 3D Glacial Aquifer Mapping. We're proposing it for only 4 counties at the present time, and that's primarily because there are other programs like the Geological Survey's location verification of Wellogic that is ongoing, that needs to continue before we branch out into more than 4. This will also give the data committee and the models committee an opportunity to evaluate whether this is a good approach and perhaps find some synergies with other things. The actual recommendation is to have the legislature allocate $120,000 to the water use program that'll be expended across 2 fiscal years by an external contractor who will map 3D aquifer properties for 4 counties using the transition probability geostatistical approach. For any of you who are familiar with the work we did in Ottawa County, that's the approach that we took, which we think was quite successful for coming up with the 3-dimensional geologic model that then fed the groundwater flow model. Of the 4 counties, the recommendation is that Eagle Water Use Program would select Cass County and then 3 other counties at their discretion. The contractor would create this 3-dimensional Lego block-like model that would go from the land surface down to the top of bedrock in counties where both glacial and bedrock aquifers are used, or it would go from the land surface down to the bottom of the screened interval for counties where bedrock is not an aquifer. And again, only counties where locations of the Wellogic records have been verified would be available for selection. So it's a $120,000 ask, pass through Eagle. Time frame is 2 years. Thank you.
All right. Our next geology new data acquisition recommendation is John Yelich will present that.
Okay, you can roll the slide, please. Okay, thank you. What we're looking at here is this is recommendations that have come from the last 7-8 years of mapping in Michigan and what we need. And so in conjunction with the USGS, which has funding available for geologic surveys to map, we looked at some counties that were recommended for additional studies by the Water Resource Division as well as MPART. And so these are counties that needed to have additional geology so that we have a better understanding of what the subsurface geology is. And our first 2 counties that we are doing are the first 2 that have the Wellogic data corrected already, and that's Ottawa and Allegan. And we'll begin mapping this month. As a matter of fact, we'll start our mapping program. But the contributions from the feds are very low because the survey does not have matching funds. This has to be a dollar for dollar match. So this proposal was made to the legislature last year, 2019. It was Senate Bill 403. It had to do with mapping particular counties, approximately 20 of them over a 10-year period. And the cost for this was $3 million per year. And we would be able to collectively map about 20 of those counties. And that would be inclusive of the ones that the Water Division had identified, as well as a number of them that MPART had. And it would be the process of putting this data together so that we could clearly identify what the bedrock topography was, what the glacial thickness was, the type of material, as well as the groundwater flow regime for the area, as well as the surface flow. And all of this would be combined with new data such as LIDAR, light detection and ranging, and drill data results.
Okay. John, you stay there. Don't go off of mute. Jim, if you could advance the slide. John, if you would take us through the next round. So we're moving out of new data acquisition, and we're moving into a new category of recommendations that pertain to well drillers.
And this is a program that the Geologic Survey started. I've been here 8 years. I started 7 years ago. And we identified a need that we have a database that we're using to try and develop answers for a lot of data. And the well drilling community was not formally trained. I started doing this with the new drillers that were being brought in for well drilling tests. We were being tested to do the well drilling. And so we presented this case to the executive committee of the Michigan Groundwater Association. They saw a need. We went to a regional meeting up in Alpena where we had close to probably 80 people that were at this particular one. About half of them were drillers and the other half were health department people. And we presented the case that if you don't understand the complete geologic section, even as a well driller, you're not going to provide accurate information that can be used for what we're using the well logic data for now. The key issue is that drilling for water, you want to know where the sand and gravel is and where it's at. And many times the only time that you really care about where a clay zone is if you need to have a clay zone between you and your drinking aquifer, and that's usually shallow wells. What we're able to present to them is that drillers can go ahead and provide that additional information. And we did that by showing them actual cores that they could not see. And they looked at the samples, and it became clearly evident to them that there were things that they could be putting onto those logs. What we're proposing now is that rather than doing it for the initial new drillers that are coming in during the winter months, that we would go to different meetings that the water well drilling community has in different parts of the country. We would load up about 3,000 pounds of core into a vehicle, and the cost in here is only for students because they need to get paid when they're doing this to haul core, because I'm not going to be hauling core anymore. So anyway, the whole point is that we go ahead and take it up to those meetings and kind of go through a training program with them, because there is a systematic program to do this. Thomas Hanna with the National Groundwater Association has an excellent summary on how to do it. It's what I've been using for the last 7 years. And we just want to make sure that the drillers understand. Another key point to this is that color is an important issue in the glacial system. And we just want to show that we need to have some colors in this too, because we can actually identify the differences in the glacial regime and the glacial type. So the bottom line is it would be that type of training program that we would do. The cost in this is just for the students and the cost of the vehicle to go ahead and take it up there. And I forget what, I can barely read the number on there, $1,800 a year. Okay. Okay, this was data communication, and in our first meetings on data, it was identified that a lot of the data was not being submitted in the forums in well logic, particularly for the high capacity wells. And in our discussion, we had a small subgroup that was made up of Eagle, as well as the Water Division, and Anita Lansauer, plus Jim Milne, and myself and Buddy Sebastian. And it became apparent that the actual applicant is the one that needs to be putting this in. And so This letter is just a summary to make sure that the applicant is aware that they can potentially be in violation for not submitting the data and not submitting it in a timely basis. And so we put together a draft letter. We hope that we can distribute it not just through the Farm Bureau, but through the groundwater magazines and other things, so that people understand when they're making application for high capacity wells, it's their responsibility to go ahead and submit all the data, or they potentially could be fined for not submitting it. This is the data that's really needed to go ahead and do the development and the assessment, particularly in the tool.
Okay, and I will highlight that in the Word documents or PDF documents that were sent out, you actually have a copy. All members should have a copy of that draft letter from the last.
Yes, yes, thank you. You're right, Brian. Thank you.
Okay, so the next two. The next two are questionably recommendations. It would be honest to say that these may be more of a report of our findings and our future work, rather than any sort of like a change in the status quo or investment request. This first one is data collection and use standards and protocols. So the statute has quite a few different provisions about being able or needing to take advantage and use other kinds of data, but we also have requirements on the quality of and the methodology behind collecting it and then using it. And essentially what we found was that many of the previous recommendations that pertain to very specific pieces of this had been accomplished. But we also found a few gaps, and that often might be more aligned with if you collect data using a certain protocol, how do you make certain adjustments so that it is appropriate to use it in this program? We also are aware of the fact that there are maybe new forms of data collection. We can think of a couple coming from the Cass County where we might need to come in behind and again take some findings and put some collection and use standards and protocols together for some new emerging kinds in the future. So largely the details of this say that we scoured it. We took account of the pieces that had been done. We've identified some that still need to be done. And we are proposing that the data committee would continue to work on those and bring those forth to you to approve them as we do them in our future work. So no investment requested, no actual protocols brought forward to you today. You can go ahead and advance for me, Jim. All right. So inland lakes, adverse resource impacts. As a reminder for all, this is something that past iterations of the Water Council has worked on for a while. Essentially, how do we get to the point of assessing or predicting, measuring adverse resource impacts for other water bodies other than streams? So inland lakes is the most in focus, but wetlands probably included as well. Again, really what we did here and what it says is that we formed a subcommittee of our committee. And we pursued that. Mike Gallagher led that. We made efforts to engage quite a few experts in the field, some new ones, some that had been involved on this topic in past iterations of the Water Council. And we tried to scour to see what had happened in the last 4 or 5 years and to see if there was anything, any developments which made it clearly easier to make strides on this subject than in the past. Largely what we found is that there had not been any wonderful technological advances that were going to make this any easier yet. But we understand what's in front of us. I will say as another minor piece of this report is that Eagle has been implementing one of the recommendations that pertains to better collection of bathymetric data for inland lakes, and they are progressing through some contracts with that. And so we kind of anticipate some results from that in the future, and we will need to continue our work on this topic. So investment proposed at this time is none because it is not clearly there yet. Okay. So thank you, everybody. You hung in with us from our rapid fire high level presentation. Hopefully you have all been able to have a little bit of time to read through the written forms that we sent. Most of those are 1 to 2, maybe 3 pages, and hopefully those have answered some of your questions ahead of time. But just in case, we have some time remaining here, and we would love to answer some questions or take some comments about any of these or all of them from you. And I have pretty much all the members of the data committee are here, so I may try to quarterback this, but quickly pass off different questions to the right person.
All right, Jim, what might be helpful is as people are thinking of questions and thinking of things, it might be helpful to back us up to slide number 14, because that's the first, I think, actual recommendation that's coming forward, so that people can go to specific slides if they have questions, or we can just kind of go through them one by one. Doug, I saw your hand and you've just put it back down.
No, I didn't
no,
mean
you didn't?
to.
Okay. All right, Doug, and then Kelly.
All right, so Brian, I'm assuming the way that you presented this to us is in the order of your importance, correct? That is the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database would be the first highest priority, or these all have equal? And as a follow-up, kind of the new data acquisition needs, you listed 4 different things in there. Are those all reliant on having certain steps done, or how does this all fit in?
Great questions. So the any level of priority that you derive might have been implicit, but it was not explicit. And no, don't take the order to be representative of our prioritization. The integrated database one was one that definitely came out, I think, pretty universally as a very high value proposition for Michigan. But really, the order that we did them, most of it was just clustered by topic. So stream flow is not necessarily more important than geology or groundwater or anything like that. Certainly, you can take that the last 2. The collection protocols and that stuff aren't, obviously priorities, but no, please don't derive that. I think it would probably be difficult for our committee to tell you, like, within new data acquisition, which ones are the greatest value. So I think the second part of your question that I would tell you is we tried to balance what we recognize we need to do or want to do for each one of those categories of data with the reality of where we're at today. And in some instances, I think you saw some cost estimates for things that we really believe in that are pretty good, pretty cost efficient strategies. And we recognize in other ones that we may have said, here's what we need to get done. And maybe it will be too expensive, maybe it won't, but we're just going to say the work that needs to be done. And then, we won't hold back in our financial investment piece because we're not sure whether we'll get it. We're going to send the message that we do need to invest that way. But, with the stream flow, you see a mix. We would love to do a lot more stream flow data collection than we've proposed to do. So that one kind of just maintaining our current level, you could see that as a very accurate sort of struggle between what we'd like to do and what might be realistic given the state finances.
All right, thank you.
All right, Kelly.
I first would like to really thank this group for all of this information you've provided. It is slightly overwhelming to some of us. If you could go, I think it's slide 18, where it talks about joining the monitoring network. I really like the expanded network that this would provide, and I think everyone would agree we definitely need more information. If I'm not mistaken, though, I think the USGS also operates a voluntary monitoring well network, and I think the cost kind of drops substantially with that. And I think we're asking to put into this that I'd like to see that joining that voluntary network would be a good add to this. It just shows that we're kind of looking at not only the things that cost money, but where can we get information from multiple areas. And I do believe that that voluntary network is still overseen by USGS. So I think the quality of data is still would still be there.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. That did come up, and I'll kick this over to Ralph to see if he has anything more for you. But an original draft of this did mention the use of volunteers. We though as a committee also identified some potential problems with volunteers when it comes into like a homeowner doing direct measures on their own drinking water well versus just a purely monitoring well. And so for the purpose of this recommendation, we kind of backed off the very specific mention of how much volunteers would be used, but I know that it still wasn't intent, and I believe, Ralph would probably still love to figure out how to use that as much as possible. Ralph, are you handy?
Yes, absolutely. We call that provided data or homeowner or citizen science data, we call that furnished record that we actually include in our database. It goes through similar QA processes and oversight that all the rest of USGS data goes through. But, as I think it was Dave Lush who pointed out that during his work in Ottawa County, the Ottawa County Health Department had some issues with homeowners taking the caps off their wells and putting a steel tape or an electric tape down their wells without really knowing the disinfecting processes and making sure that they, treat the tapes or whatever they put down there with bleach beforehand. Another approach to that is using automated methods. For example, there is a radar unit that you can mount on top of the cap that sends a signal, sends a ping down to the water level and records that water level and reports it through the internet. And we've had some discussions with various vendors on doing the same thing there. So there's another way we could get around that. But certainly being able to use citizen provided data would be a great asset to all of us.
All right, Frank.
Yeah, this one is on the stream flow, and the answer may have already been answered, been provided here, because I was concerned about just asking for keeping the current program going without indicating that there is need for increased effort in this area. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit more of that discussion. Share a little more of that discussion about how you arrived at this recommendation for not seeking new funds.
Yeah, well, it was a balance. Obviously, we've, we're seeking some new investments and some, some pretty honest investments in some of the geology and groundwater components. For stream flow, would definitely like to see those, but in recognition of, the $1 to $3 billion state budget shortfall, we were trying to moderate our hope. And when, we uncovered the fact that just the existing level is jeopardized after, one additional year with not an easy understanding of where we were going to replace that. When we took a look at the cost to replace it, we figured that, while not ideal and while it's not an advancement of data, it probably was a realistic compromise given the budget situations. And about the only thing I could say about, coming in and not locking it in there for, 10 years is that the previous recommendation, the planning, we would hope that undergoing that very formal strategic plan for data acquisition would give us the more thorough and detailed justifications to seek an advancement in the pace of stream flow data after that project was completed.
All right, Buddy.
I just have two questions. One's for Ralph. Ralph, on your recommendation that you gave or the presentation, you're going to drill 2 wells per county. Are those going to be glacial and bedrock, or just monitoring water levels only? That's my question on that.
Yeah, and that approach would be kind of dealt with in the initial evaluation step of the whole program. As you can imagine, there are different objectives behind different networks or different strategies. For example, if we were only interested in a water withdrawal assessment tool, we would focus on the glacial materials. If we are focused on drinking water sources or regional groundwater flow or regional systems, our approach might be different, and we might include some more bedrock wells. But this program really wants to build on what we can find as far as existing monitoring wells. Again, there was a program that was in place in the late 80s. Whether those wells still exist and whether they still are in good hydraulic connection with the aquifer, that's a whole nother question, and that's why we'd have to do a lot of field work. But yeah, it would be a mix, and it would be based on the objectives. And certainly in higher water use areas, such as say Southwest Michigan, we would probably focus more on the glacial materials than we would on the bedrock. But it varies from region to region, and it varies with objectives of the program.
Okay, thank you for that. My second question is for Dr. Lush on his 3D mapping. Was that strictly going to be based on current WellLogic data, or were you going to take other data, the USGS, MGS? How are you going to make that 3D map?
The primary data source would be the WellLogic lithology files. But if we have available to us other borehole information from MGS's work in the county mapping program, for instance, we would certainly incorporate that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Abby.
Okay, unmute. First of all, great job generally on all of these recommendations. I just had some thoughts on the letter of what property owners need to know about high capacity wells. You know, I guess I have some thoughts. First of all, it starts off about the review done by the water withdrawal assessment or the program, EAGLE. And I don't think that's what you should focus on early on. I think it should just be upfront. This is what you need to know about high capacity wells and that they are responsible. If you want to talk about the data gaps, then that might be useful down below. But to start off with that, I don't think is, in my opinion, is where you want to head with that. I think you want to be upfront, succinct, and then get into, you know, maybe the regulations and things. I found it a little onerous reading through it. And so I think it's good to convey briefly what you want to deliver in terms of messages here, and then get into the specifics of what high capacity wells are. You also mentioned early on, do I need to register my high capacity well, with actually not explaining what registration is. So some things like that. So I just thought it needed some tweaking a little bit, but otherwise I think it's great.
May I say, can you provide some comments to us? I'd be glad to take.
I could do that, but
Thank you.
I wasn't going to just blow them up.
Thanks, Eddie.
but I do have some thoughts on it. So if
Good.
that's
Thank
okay
you.
with you, I'll put some edits
Oh, that's
in.
great. That's great. Thanks.
All right, Pat.
Thank you. This question is directed toward either Dave Lush or John Yelich. Looking at both the geology #1, the 3D mapping, and geology #2, you know, I'm familiar with both processes. I mean, obviously there's two different costs, but what I'm struggling with is I'm just not sure if these are meant to be competing or complementary methods. And because the first geology #1 had Cass County, but you really didn't identify the other 3 counties. And then the second one had some counties identified. So that's really the nature of my question, is I'm just not sure how the two would work together.
This is Dave Lush. I'll start by saying they're really two separate but complementary recommendations. The mapping one I'll let John refer to more, but as you're familiar with it, it involves a much more detailed look at the 3-dimensional characteristics of the glacial package in a county using geophysics and other methods along with boreholes. The 3D mapping that geology number 1 that's on the screen now is utilizing point data and then extrapolating those across 3-dimensional Lego block like we did in Ottawa County. So even when MGS finishes mapping a county, the transition probability approach is still, in my opinion, one of the most robust ways of going about making the 3-dimensional geologic model from point data. So in that way, they're complementary. And that's one of the reasons why the recommendation expressly says we will select Cass County, both because we have a currently existing model for that area, and we can evaluate improvements and differences between what the TP approach showed as the 3-dimensional character of the aquifer system versus what's currently in the model. And when MGS finishes Cass County, we can blend those two perspectives together. So in my mind, they're complementary, not antagonistic toward one another.
Okay, Pat, this is John. The program that we're talking about is something that's going to take more than just a few months. And by changing the input to the 3D, and this is why they are separate, we hope that we can do something that's a little different. But the way that Dave Lush has talked about it, the building blocks, these are big parameters. What we're going to be looking at is a more refined approach. So what I just wanted to just agree on is that we really need to be looking at the detailed one, and this can give some preliminary answers, but it's not the whole picture. This is just an understanding, but also understand that there's a lot of complexity that was in Ottawa County that's coming out now once we have more data, and that just needs to be integrated in. But the program that was originally done at least identified where we had critical issues in the county. So the bottom line is that they both can serve a purpose, but by using real data in the geology one, it would help at least give it more credibility.
Perfect. Thank you for the explanation.
All right, Jason.
Thanks, Laura. I have a question for Todd related to slide 19. With Todd's work in Cass County, I guess my question, based on what he's seen and the complexities that we have in Cass County in the geology, is he comfortable with the proposal? Or Todd, would you feel that we need to have additional aquifer tests?
I guess what I would say is that there's complexity in the physical layers of the geology, especially in the glacial environment, and there's just as much variability in the aquifer hydraulic properties, meaning a fine sand in the thumb of Michigan may not be the same as a fine sand in southwest Michigan. So trying to tie the lithologies to the aquifer hydraulic characteristics can be real problematic unless we're able to verify it with a bunch of stuff or a bunch of tests in the local area. I think Cass County had 12 aquifer tests prior to the pilot, and we added 25 on top of that. So, you know, part of it depends on are we mapping the physical geology, and part of it are we mapping the hydraulic properties and tying that to that physical geology map. So it's kind of a multi-pronged question.
Doug, is your hand still up from before, or did you have another question? Because I do want to make sure we are respectful of time and don't.
Yeah, I have one more question, and I guess it just kind of goes through that, you know, as we look, there's a lot more discussion on increasing the data that comes in. Obviously, this was the data report. If all of a sudden we got the geology information from both 1 and 2, and we captured that, do we have a system in place to utilize that data, or what would we do with it once we got it?
All right, so I'll just kick that over to the modeling committee.
Okay. Well, that's
no,
what
I'm just
sure.
no.
Right?
No, I'm just kidding. I mean, you know, it goes back and forth, right? So when you have a limited amount of data, you can do models to use it. Heck, and you know, when your data is really limited, people like to create a lot of modeling tools to try to harness every drop of information from a little bit of data possible. And so I think, in my opinion, through time, Doug, this is going to be a back and forth for the program. We need to fundamentally collect better, more refined data, more of it. And each time we do, we can improve the quality of our predictions, even using the existing models. But the more data that you get, you can actually use different models. And then once you've gotten to the point that you get with them, in order to make a fundamental improvement again, at some point you have to have better data again. So I always think of data and modeling kind of going back and forth. I think what you're getting from the flavor of the data committee right now is that across the board, I don't think I heard one person really say anything remotely like, well, this kind of data, we kind of have a reasonable amount. Nobody's saying that. I mean, it's not close. It's not even close.
Okay.
Yeah, Doug, this is Jim. Just a quick note about how the new data can be used. Any new stream flow data can be used real time by both the tool and for site-specific reviews, alternative analyses, permit reviews by the staff in terms of revising stream index flow, possibly looking at stream bed conductance data. Aquifer property data is not real-time conversion for use in the tool at present. Certainly that data, when appropriate, can be used right away by the water use program staff for SSRs, for alternative analyses, for permit reviews. And hopefully when we get this in a publicly accessible format, it can be available to any interested party.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Doug, I shouldn't, but there's one other minute is on that long-term planning recommendation. I mean, that is part of what we'd like to do too, is to be able to almost do like a sensitivity analysis for different components of this program and be able to tell you, this kind of stream flow in this area will give us this. Geology over here is really what is going to move the needle on predictions. So think of it twofold. I mean, we'd like to kind of really do a sophisticated planning and tell you the value of very different kinds of data in different locations and how it can do good things for this program. But we also recognized across the board that each of these is so deficient that it's pretty darn safe investing in some strides immediately too.
All right, thanks.
I have a comment, Jim Nicholas. I can't raise a hand on the Mac here.
Okay.
And I was surprised there's nothing about biological data.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think probably, I think that in the sense of the inland lakes, we are still kind of searching for our biological or ecological metric over there. And I think that, the next time we come back with kind of the inland lakes or wetlands recommendations, I think that there will be an immense amount of biological type of data to help us ever get to that. On the stream side, it's a good question. I think that we probably are just still securely using the DNR's predictions of fish population basis from the original publications. You're right, it's not ripe either. It's the actual amount of sampling that the DNR gets to do is nowhere near what they would like to do either. But yeah, if you have specific,
I was just saying, like in the planning you're going to do for data collection, it should be kept in mind the level of accuracy associated with the targets we're trying to hit or avoid, right?
Yeah.
So that we're not like have this fantastic water data that we can do all this stuff with, but the biological data is much, much coarser. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying we need to make sure we hold those things in balance is all. So.
Great point. Great point. Fantastic. Thank you, Jim.
All right, thanks everybody. Let's kind of, as we described earlier, let's kind of go back through with each of these recommendations. Again, you don't have to give a lot of explanations as to why, but we'll just kind of go through them and see if there's anybody who's got issues with moving forward with a recommendation as written, and kind of pull those out so that you can connect later with the data committee to talk more about it and see, you know, either what needs to happen with that recommendation, or if there's something that the full council needs to go back and discuss. So let's start back at, I think your recommendations start on slide 14. Any issues or anything that anybody wants to pull back or not move forward as written with this recommendation? This is recommending the legislature appropriate $170,000 for the water management database. All right, I'm hearing none. Let's go to slide 16. I think that's the next that's the next recommendation. This is new data acquisition and planning. And this is analysis and communication for existing stream flow, groundwater, and geologic data, $100,000. And Jim, if you can jump forward to slide 16, that will let people look at that who are participating on the computer. All right.
I'm on 16.
All right, thank you. Any questions or anybody who needs to pull that one out? All right, I'm hearing none. Next slide, 17. This one is going to be for new data acquisition for stream flow, which maybe not so much new data acquisition as it is making sure we have funding once the Clean Michigan Initiative bonding ends, which I'm stunned it hasn't yet. So this is for funding for stream flow analysis. All right, hearing none. Next slide, 18. This is new data acquisition for groundwater, and this is the having Eagle join the National Groundwater Monitoring Network. And engaging in a per county installation of monitoring wells. Any objections or wanting to pull that recommendation out or not move forward with it? Kelly, you got your hand up. All right.
Yes. Sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Is this where, like, would it be possible, given the discussion, to add to this about the volunteer network as well, or would that be separate?
Brian, Ralph, do you guys want to take that back and discuss it more in the committee?
Hey, Ralph. If you're there, I know that you had it in there originally and strategically tried to kind of hide it. Do you feel as though it's still really there and a great possibility, or do you think that we could work with Kelly to add it back in? I mean, I know you've been there and you pulled it back. Any thoughts on how to adjust that?
Yeah, you know, quite honestly, there was no strategery other than the discussion that we had at our last meeting, that when Dave brought up the issues with the local county health departments. I think it would be a great thing to look into, and it could actually result in lower costs to the overall network. We had proposed putting it in a pilot scale study in and around Ingham County, since we do rely on groundwater resources for our drinking water here. Certainly we could add it in there, and you know, it would offer another alternative here for consideration and discussion.
Okay, Todd.
I would like to encourage the council to take a hard look at that. We actually participate in that in Indiana in the voluntary network, and the wells that we put in there are dedicated monitoring wells. I know Potato Growers has their own dedicated monitoring wells. Beck Seeds does. Southwest Michigan Farmers do. Midwest Water Stewards do. There's a number of them where it is actually dedicated groundwater monitoring wells, and they're actually usually located near high capacity wells also. So you get aquifer test data from it too. So I think it would be good to at least include it as an option. And I think there's definitely some cost savings involved with that, just for what it's worth.
Okay, so I'm hearing some pretty broad interest in kind of making some tweaks to this. Maybe we pull this back and let the data committee work with the folks who are interested in doing that, to add that to the recommendation, to be brought back to the council. Any questions that don't have to do with that, with the adding in volunteer monitoring network? All right. Oh, Buddy, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just me being the business guy I am. I ran some numbers. Ralph, are you sure on that 259 for the first year and 226 for installing those wells and then monitoring them? I mean, is that USGS doing all the work and everything, or is that subcontracting it out? The reason I'm asking is I'd hate to go and recommend this to the legislature. I think this is a great idea, by the way, but recommend it and then to find out down the road that we're short on funds to make it happen.
Yeah, these budget estimates are based on a combination of using existing wells and installing new wells. So again, there's cost savings there, but with the equipment and the site recon, basically going out to wells and making sure they're still, functioning as the way we hope they would, and they're in good hydraulic connection with the aquifer. Those were our estimates. I will say that these numbers are a few years old, because I originally proposed this to the Water Use Advisory Council back in 2017, I think it is. So, I mean, they could be a little on the low side, but overall, I think that they're pretty on the mark. And again, USGS would be contracting drilling if we were to get some additional wells drilled.
And that's not my concern. I want to make sure that when we went for it, we had accurate numbers to make sure that the project could be completed. That's my, and if we're going to go back to committee and maybe add some voluntary things in there, maybe that's the time to actually tweak those numbers and move forward with good numbers. And that's all I have.
All right, thank you.
All right, moving on, slide 19. This is a geology project, selecting the 4 counties to do transition probability geostatistical analysis. Questions or concerns about that? Yep, Buddy.
I'm just going to say this. I've had personal experience with 3D mapping a little bit. I don't think there's enough data out there to do it accurately and to have anything that's going to be of worth right now. We're talking about data, and I think we all agree that we need more data. And I don't think there's enough accurate data right now to do it. That's my feelings on it. I would not move forward with this.
Okay. Buddy, I guess I will say I would second the support for kind of pulling this one back and discussing it some more in committee, because I kind of feel the same way. I'm not sure we're ready for this action at this point. So I'd like to discuss that some more as well. Other comments, questions about that? And again, we don't have to have the whole discussion here today, just acknowledging, are we going to discuss this more with committees?
This is Jim Nicholas. I guess my only common response to that, which I mean, I agree there's not a lot of data in areas, but we're still making decisions based on the data that are there without them having been looked at systematically with the methodology such as is proposed here. And if this is focusing on location verification and such with the WellLogic data, then I would expect that to be a relatively robust data set to use this approach on. You know, Cass County, I mean, you know, Todd's developing a groundwater flow model based on the data that are out there, right, which involves layering and connecting layers and that sort of thing. So anyway, I'm fine with your comments. I just thought I'd reflect on some issues that we have anyway without doing this.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Dave, anything quick that you want to add before we move on to the next recommendation?
Yeah, I do not agree that there is not enough data to do this, and we've proven that in Ottawa County. And I would say that the transition probability approach used against WellLogic data and all other available borehole data is superior to any existing model in the state of Michigan, bar none, because it removes the subjectivity of the model creator deciding how to bridge between data points when stratigraphy pinches out and when it doesn't, and what the connection is both horizontally and vertically. It removes all that from human bias, and we do that with a geostatistical approach, which is mathematically sound and probability based. And I just think that what this is asking for a relatively modest investment is to evaluate all those things that you're all talking about. And that's why we demanded that Cass County be selected, so we can compare that with both MGS mapping and with the evolving Cass County model.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. If you're willing, we'll pick that discussion up some more with the data committee and go on to the next recommendation. This is geologic mapping target areas of Michigan. And that's slide 20. Any questions, concerns, or desire to pull that one out and have some more discussion with it? Doug?
My only question is, this is an outlier in the request for cost at $3 million a year. And I'm not saying that's not what it would really take to get it done in a kind of a reasonable time frame, but John, if there was less money, could this task still be performed?
Bottom line is that not to the level of data that we need to give us the answers that we need in those critical counties. Cass County is coming close to having that type of data set right now. And just to go back to number one, is that we'll talk about this in the data committee. That may be the one that we really need to test to see whether or not there's enough just by comparing the two models. The one that Dave Lush is talking about, and then some of the things that we're putting together right now in Cass County. Bottom line is we need to have the data if we're going to go forward. And this is actually what I consider to be a reduced effort to try and get the quality data we need.
Okay. Doug, are you asking for this one to be pulled back, or was that just a question?
No, that was just a question,
Okay.
just as we look at the whole thing, just wondering.
Okay.
And if I can also comment, is that this was proposed in the budget back in 2019. It was taken out because of the change because of the result of COVID, but it's still a demand that is not just water use, but it also has to do with PFAS related, getting those counties mapped where we need to have it so that we know where it's going.
Okay. If there's no other comments, we can move on to the next slide, slide 21, and this is well driller data reporting and the trainings. $3,600 for 2 years worth of training. I guess since I'm already talking, I'll ask a quick question of John. John, is there a reason why this only goes on for 2 years and is not a continuing training effort to bring new drillers up to speed or to offer continuing education?
Good question, Laura. It's only because we were talking about 2 years and everything. So,
so in reality, this should be ongoing.
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay.
Sorry, that's right.
Okay.
All right.
Any questions or need to pull this one out for more discussion? All right. Next one, slide 22. This one we actually already discussed this a little bit. Abby brought up that she was going to make some comments on the letter that's going to go out for outreach. Any other questions, comments, or need to pull this one out? And I guess I will ask, if this is already underway, does it need to be in the report that we send to the legislature?
I would say not. I think that if we can get the letter approved, that we can go ahead and start distributing it where we need to in the appropriate publications.
Okay. Buddy, you have your hand up?
I'm going to disagree with John. I think we need to let the legislature know that we saw some need for clarification for the general public, which that's their constituents. And we thought we better clarify things with them before they came to the legislature. I think it's good to let them know that the council is concerned about making sure we're sending the right message. That's my opinion.
I retract my statement. I agree.
Okay. Dave?
I think that raises a good point as to the purpose of our recommendations. And I agree. I think we will want some kind of section in the report that deals with things like this, of just things we're doing that are ongoing, that are important for various reasons. So I think we may have a couple elements of our report. One will be the budgetary thing, which is what we're focusing on. But the other would be talking about this and other things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So is there anyone who would have an objection to this and other things that we point out to say, hey, you know, we're already doing this. We don't have to ask for more money for this, to sort of be gathered into a section of that report that's going to be, here's the stuff we're already doing or that's already underway. Any objections to that? Buddy, is your hand still up or did it come up again? Oh, all right. Dave Lush? You're still muted.
Just a process question quickly. So Geology 1 has been pulled until the committee does more work, but it's unclear to me, you know, the committee was unanimous in recommending this. So I don't think the committee itself is going to change its mind. Is pulling it meaning will not be in the report for December? And if it has a chance, what's the time schedule to rectify the issues?
So I mean, I would say, and Brian Burrows, please weigh in as appropriate, just from what we were discussing kind of before this meeting and getting ready for this process, is we feel like that if there is a recommendation that gets pulled for more discussion, that the folks who have an issue with that should meet with that committee to talk about their concerns, to see if there's something that they can work out in terms of making that recommendation, you know, in a way that they're comfortable with it moving forward. And if not, you know, or whatever that result is, bring it back to the next full council meeting and say, we talked about it and here's, you know, and here's what we came up with, or we talked about it and here's the people who don't agree with it moving forward. And then the council's got to make a decision. Do we include it anyway? And just allow the people who don't agree with it the opportunity to weigh in at that point. I guess in some way kind of similar to the method that we used with the previous council, which was, we said, hey, we have consensus on this, but you know, but one or two people disagree with it, and here's what they have to say, and giving them still the opportunity to talk about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Dave, this is Brian Burrows too. Yes, I'll reiterate too. I think by next meeting, October 20th, we're going to be in a crunch with figuring out whether a recommendation is going to be at consensus or not. And you know, we'll figure out minority reports or just abstaining. But today, you know, we're presenting a lot of these things for the first time to the full council, really. And so I would say that any of these that have a clear pulled out for a problem do not have consensus approval. We'll work over the next week or so to make sure that anybody who has some concerns, questions, ideas, edits, tweaks, is linked with either the committee responsible or individual point people responsible. We'll try to take care of them so that it will be in a form by October that hopefully will get consensus. So we'll be working over the next couple of weeks. It does not mean that if it's got a problem today that it's not going to go. It just means we'll work out the tweaks over the next few weeks prior to the next meeting.
So what I heard the complaint was that there's not enough data. Well, that's a factual thing, and I don't see that we're going to work that out.
We'll have the discussion. We'll discuss it all out, but not today at this meeting because we're on a tight timeline. It's just going to pull it out and we'll discuss those and we'll facilitate discussion and see if we can get there or not get there or just have better understanding among parties.
Okay. Moving on, slide 23, data collection and use standards and protocols. This one doesn't have a new investment proposed, and I guess I'll ask the same question that we had about the previous recommendation. Does this go in a section of the report in which we talk about stuff that's kind of already ongoing, or does this need to be a recommendation saying, hey, we recommend this happen?
My recommendation for now, Laura, is that we can play with, in my opinion, we can play with the formatting of the final report and lumping and grouping. I would just see today whether if anybody has a concern with what's been kind of put in paper as a report, knowing that it may, like you say, be formatted into a different section.
Okay, so anybody who feels like they need to discuss that one more? All right, and then last recommendation, slide 24, inland lakes, adverse resource impacts. Any need to pull this one out to discuss it more? All right, thanks guys, appreciate that. We're going to move quickly through, and I know we still have a break in our schedule, but we're going to do 2 committees and then take a break, take a quick break, and then do the other 2. So we'll move right into models, and Dave, if you are ready to launch off with that one, we'll go ahead and go.
I'm ready. Let's go next. Okay. So just one note that one of the things that was sent to everybody is the models committee topics was updated and sent out to you. So if you want to see all the things we're working on, it's in there. So we've just got a limited number of things that we're going to talk about today. So to summarize what we're going to talk about today, there's the Michigan Hydrologic Framework. There is a budgetary request that goes with that. We grouped several small things together under improvements to the tool and the process. A is the update user's interface to display registration information. There's dollars associated with that. B is to identify water management areas to be modified in an SSR. We're going to change that recommendation, so there's no budgetary one. I'll explain that when we get to it. C is better provide estimates for aquifer properties. There will be a budget for that. And D is develop tools to better represent streamflow depletion. There's not a budget at this point for that. Under 3, there will be a budget request for that, incorporate information from calibrated models into the screening tool. And the 4th one is just kind of an informational one, and there'll be no budget at this point for that. Next slide. So to move this whole program forward, we think that it's really important that and to keep it on a scientific basis. Next slide, please, Jim. There we go. We think it's really important to have both data and models, that they're both absolutely critical for the scientific validity of this program. And so I'm going to focus right now on the Michigan Hydrologic Framework, which the purpose of that is to be able to facilitate the creation of models. We've talked about this in some detail, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It was recommended to the council a number of months ago. But the idea is that you can take the real world and gather data on it. You can put this data into GIS layers. These layers can then become input to hydrologic models, and then the output of hydrologic models can be collected, analysis done, and used for input to other models. So this is a very important part of what work needs to be done to keep this program going forward. Next slide, Jim. So the things that the Michigan Hydrologic Framework can do, just to summarize it, is that there'll be a statewide GIS databases. It'll incorporate model results into the decision framework. There'll be access to data analysis and model results. There'll be a smart map. Next slide, Jim. At least I'm not seeing it. We'll also incorporate new data and analysis. It can either house or link the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database that we talked about, and it'll facilitate the creation of models that link climate, surface water, and groundwater. So these are a lot of things that can be done. Some of these we're talking about as separate elements. Some of these things can be done on their own and have value on their own, but we want to have this framework that's going to pull it all together. To create this framework, we're talking about $850,000. Modeling is such an important part of this that we would also like to create 3 regional models to become part of it and become the first ones into this framework that then can be used for various purposes. And that's about $1.2 million. So the total is $2 million, $2,050,000 spread over 3 years. So that's the first recommendation. We'll come back for questions in a minute. Next slide, Jen. So the next one is to update the user interface to display registration information. Now, this is something that questions have come up. That sometimes the department has to answer people's questions about, how much water is available and what else is going on. And so there could be some savings of staff time, and it would be useful to consultants and the users to have this information available. The cost is higher than what we originally thought based on newer information as to what it costs working through DTMB, as we're estimating $50,000, which I think is ridiculous, and maybe we want to look into that. But there's still maybe a question on this one, whether that amount of money is worth the effort, and we may want to have that discussion. The second one is to identify which water management areas have been modified by a site-specific review. This information is useful to planners and to researchers. And we have an agreement with Eagle that they would provide this information on a periodic basis. We thought that as long as they're going into the database, maybe it could just be modified and make it available to the public as part of that. But then when the estimate came up to be $50,000, it's kind of like, man, I don't think this is worth it. So I think just sticking with the report is probably good enough. But this may be pointing something out that if there's a way for us as a council to figure out a way to deal with DTMB, because they're clearly important to getting work done. They seem to be a bottleneck, though, and a very expensive bottleneck. So we may want to have some separate discussions on that as to what we may be able to do about that. Next slide. This is another recommendation, which is compiling aquifer properties for the water withdrawal assessment tool. And this would use a GIS method that's been developed to identify all of the water management areas that are dominated by unconfined glacial aquifer conditions. And then knowing which ones are dominated by this, and I'll show you what the characteristics are in a minute here. We would change to a different storage coefficient, a higher storage coefficient that will give us better estimates of the stream flow depletion. The number of well logs with standardized aquifer properties has also greatly increased in the last number of years. And this information can and should be used, and we would like to have that compiled together along with information that's been gathered on individual pump tests from these high capacity wells. So we like to combine those data and improve the statewide estimates for transmissivity for both glacial and bedrock aquifers. So for the first one, or for this, it would be $12,000 for a contractor to actually do this work. But the second part, again, points to the problem I've already pointed out. For DTMB to do their part of changing the program, that we're estimating $88,000. So there seems to be a misbalance here, but at this point, these are the best estimates we have. This work would be done over an 18-month period. And I think it's very important work for us to do. Next slide. For us to identify which water management areas are dominated as unconfined, this has been proposed to set the standard. If a water management area has 16 or more wells per square mile, and at least 70% of those are unconfined, then we would say that, yes, this meets this standard. If there's fewer wells, but more than 8 per square mile, then we would require at least 80% of those well logs would have to show us unconfined. Jim, the next slide, if you can. And this slide shows in 12 counties where this analysis was done, what the distribution is. There we go. And so this would be something that we think has value to, again, improve the accuracy of what information is going into the tool. And it would raise the storage coefficient based on available data and a preponderance of data. Okay, the next recommendation deals, or excuse me, the next one deals with improvements to the tool and process and developing better streamflow depletion methodologies. We do have a work group working on this, but at this point, there's not a recommendation or budget recommendation at this point. Next slide, Jim. This is something that we're calling meta modeling, just to let you hear this term for the first time. And what it would do, it would allow us to incorporate information from calibrated models into the screening tool. This is something that there's been an interest in doing. It would take the screening tool to an absolutely another level, far beyond what it can do right now. So this is trying to move forward in a giant step. I can tell you personally, I have been very impressed with how well the screening tool has worked to date. I think it's done exactly as we intended it to, as we designed it. But as we've been moving through time, what we found is that there's more and more site-specific reviews that are needed, that we gather more information because of this, but we're not being able to update the screening tool beyond some fairly simple ways of doing it. So what we'd like to be able to do is to develop a numerical model that can accurately represent the hydrogeology of an area, especially the stream-aquifer interactions, and account for the local water budget, with the goal of reasonably representing the streamflow depletion that occurs from area wells. Such a model can be used in the site-specific review process, and there's high value in that. But you wouldn't be able to use that kind of model in a screening process. It would take, when you add in a new well, you might have to make modifications to the model. It may take many minutes or even hours to run a solution for a new well. So it would not work in the screening process. So the idea is that we could use a meta model, which is a computationally efficient surrogate for the more detailed numerical model. The numerical model can be run many hundreds or even thousands of times to determine what the streamflow depletion is for wells at different locations and at different pumping rates. And the results can be statistically modeled. The statistical model, or again, meta model, can be used to rapidly predict the depletion from a new well. This could then become part of the screening tool, and there are many possible statistical modeling approaches. So the recommendation here is to evaluate meta modeling approaches, develop and test a meta model with a well-calibrated numerical groundwater model, and determine the meta model's accuracy and if it can be reliably designed to provide a reasonably conservative solution in the screening tool. I want to emphasize that we are not saying that we have in hand a model that will do this. We're saying that we believe that the possibility exists. We would like to test this out. We need a study to be able to evaluate it and determine whether it's possible or not. If we do it as part of developing the Michigan Hydrologic Framework, we probably need an increment of about $50,000 more thrown into the total I'd given you before, and we could add this in as part of that work. If we do this as a standalone work, say we put off the Michigan Hydrologic Framework for a year or something, we're estimated about $100,000 to do this as a standalone project. Next slide, to try to give you a feel for how what this would look like. This is Kalamazoo County, and the green dots are wells that exist. And we could put in wells, and the little round dots with circles around them are an example where you could put in an array of wells. And you could actually have a model developed of this area, pump the array of wells, see what the response is, then move the array of wells, pump it again, and see what the response is. And then you take the response information and develop a statistical model that would say that you would train to be able to say that, okay, if we put in a new well here, we pump it at this pumping rate, what would the stream flow depletion be on the surrounding streams? So that would be the goal. And it would be, again, if this works, it would be an incredibly fast way of doing the calculation, similar to the analytical models that are used now as far as speed goes. So this is something that if we have an area where we feel comfortable that we have an accurate numerical model, we could use this kind of approach to modify the screening tool so that it has much more sophisticated information available to it. So this is a recommendation. Final slide. And this is just, we do not have time today to talk about the Cass County model, but just wanted to let you know, we have looked at it as part of the models committee. We will report back to you next month on that. We also expect to have some recommendations as to how to move this forward. We think that the council does potentially have a role to provide leadership in the next step, so we want to talk about that. And at this point, we do not have a budget request for it. And at this point, we don't anticipate coming up with one, but leave the door open depending on where we go with this. So with that, I will stop and take any questions as we go back or over any of this. And I may use some of my colleagues break into this as well to help answer the questions.
All right, let's have overall questions before we start going through these one by one. Kelly?
Thanks, Laura. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Kelly.
You also serve on the data committee. Is that true?
It's very true.
Okay, I thought so given our previous conversations. I am trying to take this all in, and can you, in quick layman's terms, explain to me what is the difference between what the data committee submitted as the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database and this hydrologic framework?
Excellent, excellent question. And the right slide is up. So the idea of the Michigan Integrated Water Management Database is that there are all these databases out there. They need to be pulled together and get some consistency there. But that in itself is just a database. The Michigan Hydrologic Framework is more than that because it gathers information from various databases, including this one, to create models. And then the models are created, and then the information from that goes back into the framework. So the Michigan Hydrologic Framework facilitates the creation of models that can do a lot of things, linking both climate, surface water, and groundwater, and a lot of different data sources. So the Michigan Hydrologic Framework is kind of the bigger overall thing that can house or link and facilitate model creation. The Michigan Integrated Water Management Database is simply a database, a very important one, but it is simply a database. Does that help?
For that, this framework feeds into the overall integrated database.
That's the other way around. The integrated database feeds into the framework.
Oh dear. Okay, thank you for that. I had one more question, and only because I'm only familiar with the Cass County model that was done, I had a question about your budget. So knowing the amount of money that county model, I wondered if we might need to increase your budget ask for the three regional models. I think it's on the previous slide.
Yeah, well, it's on that slide. It's three models.
Oh, I see.
$1.2 million. Yeah, so that was based on an estimate from the U.S. Geological Survey as to what it would cost for them to do this work. You know, I'm never one to turn down asking for more money, but on the other hand, there's no such thing as an endless amount of money. So I think this was a reasonable estimate. I don't know what was spent on Cass County and how that relates to this, so I can't make any comparison for you.
Todd, are
Sorry,
you
go ahead.
still on the call? I'm just wondering if you can tell us, like, I think it was close to the 1.2 million or a little bit more to do the one Cass County model. Is that true, or did I read it wrong?
Well, one thing that is probably different, Cass County, I know, included a lot of money for data collection.
Yeah. Kelly,
So
this is Jim Milne. The total budget for the Cass County study was 1.5 million, spread out over 3 years, half of which was state and the other half was private funding. But like Dave said, a good chunk of that was devoted to data collection. So how much, yeah, depending on where you want to do some of the other regional models, how much money you got to put into data collection to feed the model depends on what's available.
Other questions overall before we start going through these one by one? All right, I am seeing none, so let's go to, I think your first recommendation is slide 29, which you're on. So this is the hydrologic framework. Does anyone want to pull this out for more discussion before it goes forward as a recommendation? All right, I am seeing none here. Let's go to the next slide, slide 30, and this is updating the user interface and identifying water management units that have been modified by site-specific review. And Dave, I kind of feel like you're a little squishier on this one in terms of it actually being a recommendation, since you about lost your mind when you said it was going to cost $50,000. Is this actually a recommendation, or is this just, hey, we found out it was going to be really expensive. Are you guys sure you want to do it?
I took some initiative on my own as the co-chair of the committee, and from our discussion, I think the first one, updating the user interface, there is value to that, even if it costs $50,000, I would recommend that we go ahead with it. The other one, I think there's much less value with it, and for $50,000, I have a hard time seeing that go forward.
Okay, so in other words,
I'm open to other opinions, but I kind of, as those numbers came up, that's where I'm at.
So is it fair to say what you're saying is you want to go with the first recommendation on this slide, the update to the user interface, and not include the water management units that have been modified except for just by the periodic report that Eagle produces?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So anybody have questions about this or want to pull this one out for more discussion? All right, I am seeing none here. Let's go on to the next one, slide 31. This is compiling aquifer properties for the water withdrawal assessment tool. And this is the contractor to look at transmissivity and DTMB, incorporating estimates of transmissivity into the WAT tool. Questions, or do people feel like they want to pull this one out for more discussion? I guess I will say that I feel like I want to have more discussion on this. I get nervous when people start saying we're going to do something that's going to mess around with the WAT tool, especially when we're going to mess around with things like, hey, we're going to change we're going to change transmissivity, or we're going to or we're going to change a major factor that's in the WAT tool. I would like to have more discussion about this before it moves forward as a recommendation. Buddy, I see you have your hand up.
Laura, I just want to comment back on that because
Jim, hang on just a second. I'll let you go after Buddy, but he had his hand up, and then you.
Raise my hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let him go. Let him go ahead and go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Jim, go ahead.
I was just going to comment because not everyone in council may know that by changing the storage coefficient to unconfined aquifers, that's going to make more water available in those water management areas. So it won't restrict the amount of water that's available.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, sure thing. Buddy?
I was just gonna say that I agree with you, Laura. I always get nervous anytime we're gonna mess with either the screening tool or the batch. But I am also all for more accurate data. And if this is gonna take current inaccurate transmissivity data and make more accurate transmissivity data and also the amount of water available, I'm all for it. But I think we need to make sure that we move forward with a recommendation that that happens. That's my only comment.
Okay. So let's plan to have a little bit more discussion about this before it comes back in October, and make sure of what we're doing with that. And then
So
think,
Laura, what I'd suggest is that we schedule a committee meeting and have you and Buddy and whoever else wants to, and we will talk whatever detail you like about this.
Yep. And I would recommend any of the committees that, if someone wants to pull out and discuss their recommendations some more, schedule a committee meeting so that we can have that discussion on those particular recommendations. So thank you for bringing that up, Dave. The next recommendation I see is on slide 34, and this is incorporating information from calibrated models to the screening tool. Are there questions, or do people want to pull this one out for more discussion? I guess I will say this is one that I would also like to discuss some more, and I think part of it is because I feel like since there's not I mean, you mentioned that there's not a model that can do this yet. I feel like there's also this may be something that, and again, for more discussion, that it may be something that we're not ready for yet, or that may be a little bit premature, just given how big of a lift we have with developing data and getting the information needed for that.
Okay,
That's something I would like to discuss further.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to discuss. I want to make it clear, it doesn't mean that that's going to happen. It will come back to the council. If we ever said, hey, this looks promising, we'll come back to the council, say, do we want to do it or not? It is not saying we're going to do this. It's trying to develop a tool that would allow us to do it and see if it's feasible.
Okay. John, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to just echo one thing, is that whatever we do with the calibrated model data needs to be valid or validated data. It can't be theoretical data that's brought across. That's all I want to emphasize.
Okay. All right. So Dave, if it's all right with you, we'll take those two recommendations to discuss during a models committee meeting. And then I think for the final piece that you had on slide 36, there isn't a recommendation to go with that at this time. So that's not one we need to discuss further.
All right. So I will set up a meeting, and anyone who wants to have that detailed discussion will do it.
All right. Thank you. John, do you still have do you have a question or a comment?
No, sorry, I didn't disengage.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Okay. So thank you guys for hanging on. I know that was a huge slog. Let's take a quick break before we continue on with the other two committees. I have 2:52 on my little computer clock here. So let's come back in 5 minutes. 2:57. We'll get started again. All right. Thanks, everybody.
I made it back.
Couple of us did.
John, you got your hand up?
I do. I'm sitting on a drill rig right now, a core rig in Cass County. I stepped away when the final discussion came down about the framework. So I need to make a comment.
Okay.
All right. My comment is this, is that I've made comments on the framework having to do with substantive factual data being needed, and that's what really needs to happen for it to work. The framework is to help assist in doing things, and that's fine, but it needs to be factual data. The real issue that I have is that without having somebody on that framework committee that is even a glacial geologist has never been addressed. And this is about glacial geology. And there are 8 of them in the state that are qualified, and none of them are listed on that. And we tried to have that modified, and it didn't get any traction. So that's what one of the issues is that, and then for us to do regional models using the theoretical models is not valid, because you can make all kinds of theoretical models because you're using theoretical data, you're not using factual data. So the bottom line is that it really needs to use validated data, and then there are portions of it that make sense, but not having a glacial geologist as part of even the review, it's all data manipulators, and that's really what it's about. Sorry.
Okay, so John, just to clarify, is that a request to pull that recommendation out for more discussion? Does the recommendation itself need to have information in it that states that more explicitly, or what do you want to do with that?
Number 2, and more discussion, because I don't have time to keep writing the same recommendations again. These were sent back in 2018, and none of them were taken into account. So I think that we just need to discuss it again, because there are portions of it that make sense, but there are portions of it that do not make sense because it doesn't use.
Okay. Buddy, you have your hand up also?
Yeah, I think what John is not thinking about it until now, he's correct. We need to have a glacial geologist, and this data and this hydrologic framework, if it moves forward, has to be validated by a glacial geologist, because even Ralph would probably agree that, again, and I keep reiterating this, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but we have to make sure that whatever we do going forward has to be validated good data.
Okay, so we will add that to the list of ones that are being looked at for more discussion.
Laura, for my benefit, so recommendation on slide 29 is being pulled out for further discussion.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
All
Anything
right.
else on our previous discussion before we move on? We've got two more committees to get to, and I want to be able to turn that over to Brian to do that.
Laura, this is Brian. My teams froze up, and it took me about 5 minutes. Did we have our 5-minute break while I was working to rejoin?
Yeah, we totally did. You missed the break. So actually, it was hilarious because you said I'm back at the exact time that we were supposed to start up again. So it made it sound like you left for a break and then celebrated the fact that you were back.
Oh, no, I was celebrating that I managed to overcome my technological challenge.
All right.
Okay.
Well, in either
All
case,
right.
welcome back.
All right. Perfect. Thank you, and I apologize. All right, let's click to the next spot. I believe that this should be where our new topics committee updates are, and I know that we have basically two different groups. I'm ready to jump into the water users group to start, but I'm wondering if Pat or Jason has any sort of overall comments to make before doing that or not. Okay. All right, not hearing any. Who will present for the water users group portion?
I will, Brian. It's Emily Finnell.
Emily, thank you. You should be all set.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. I see a nod. Yep. Well, thanks everybody for your time. It's been really informative hearing all these committee updates. I can hopefully assure you that we won't need 20 minutes for our committee update, but always happy to have a lot of discussions. So just to recap, the Water Users Group Planning Committee formed out of the New Topics Committee end of May this past spring. And it was really focused on helping the department with the development of a process for successfully convening water user committees to develop shared solutions for managing water resources. And then secondly, to try to address that sort of overarching goal of developing educational materials about Michigan's water laws, water use programs, and water user committees. And so we felt as a committee these kind of blended together and started focusing on developing an outline for a water user committee users manual as a starting point for our discussions. We felt like that was the right place to start because from that would then lead to the development of some of these educational materials. So we've had a series of committee meetings over the course of the summer. And I noticed this morning that our slide says that we met on August 25th. We did also meet on August 3rd. So we've had a couple meetings in August, and we have paused our development of the outline for the Water User Committee manual, and we've been focusing on a couple of smaller discussions because of some questions that have come up in our committee, and that was around sort of the motivation statement. You know, what ultimately motivates water users wanting to come to the table, since this is voluntary, to work together cooperatively to develop shared solutions for managing water resources. And then how will the water use program really interact with these water user committees? What does the statute say versus, you know, what makes sense for good practice and good process? And that's led us into a fun place of talking about Michigan's water law, common law, reasonable use doctrine. And so we've been working over the last 6 weeks or so to try to put down on paper, actually, I guess summer's gone by fast, it's been about 2 months, to try to flush out a series of kind of commonly asked questions that are coming up in our committee about that interaction between the department, the program, and water user committees, and what the statute says and what ultimately would be a good process as far as who comes to the table, sort of what are the rules of the game, what authorities are there. So we're still in the midst of working on that. What I want to focus on our update today is really on the water user group recommendation. So next slide. We have one recommendation for the Water Use Advisory Council's consideration, and that is, given the complexity, obviously, of Michigan's water rights and laws, our water resources, and the potential for conflict, our committee is recommending that Eagle develop a water user committee's user manual to help equip water user committees with the kind of information that they'll need, tools and resources to help develop realistic shared solutions to sustainably manage water use. So the goal of the manual would be to provide steps that will assist the department as well as the water user committees with successfully developing shared solutions for managing water resources. We feel that this is an essential tool for the water use program and the future success of these committees. And it will also provide an opportunity to educate people about Michigan's water laws and water rights, the role of state agencies and the various water user groups that are laid out in the statute, and really the kind of tactical strategies and best practices for water user committees to achieve success. So there's three scenarios that we're envisioning the water user committees would be convened around, and that would be following the denial by Eagle of a proposed new large withdrawal due to the likelihood of it causing an ARI. In that situation, the water user committee would be convened by the water user. The second scenario would be following a determination by Eagle that an ARI is occurring or is likely to occur, and there is no water user committee that already exists. So that committee would be convened by Eagle. And then there's the third option, which is large quantity water users choosing to self-convene to proactively manage local water resources and plan for future use. So we're recommending as a committee that Eagle issue a competitive funding opportunity to solicit grant proposals. And this was written up in our 2-pager that we shared. I think you may have received at the end of last week. Using a similar approach to the Sustainable Small Harbors Initiative, and many of you may not be familiar with that initiative. It used an integrated assessment approach, and it was facilitated by Michigan Sea Grant and MSU Extension. The Office of the Great Lakes was the co-sponsor for this project with DNR Parks and Recreation Division. And the integrated assessment approach involves a multidisciplinary project team, and they work collaboratively with the state agency, natural resource managers, policymakers, stakeholders, and other interested parties. And this approach would be used to develop the water user committee manual, implement a comprehensive stakeholder engagement strategy. We think that's really critical to ensure meaningful input and feedback on the manual. And then what we're recommending through this grant proposal that we would envision funding, would there be at least one or more case studies of water user committees in a watershed management area where there's the potential for an ARI be conducted. So using this similar approach to the integrated assessment, this project team would be very collaborative, working with the state resource managers, stakeholders, and other interested parties. And through this project, they would develop the tools and strategies in the user manual that would really equip these water user committees with what they need to be successful in developing these shared solutions. So we're estimating, based on the experience of the Office of the Great Lakes and the Sustainable Small Harbors Initiative, that the cost of this project to develop the manual, implement a comprehensive stakeholder engagement process, and then conduct 1 or 2 case studies is approximately $250,000. We're actually proposing that funding for this project be provided through the Office of the Great Lakes. We in the office administer the Michigan Great Lakes Protection Fund, and depending on the outcome of our sort of budget process that we're in right now, we are hopeful and anticipating that we would be able to have funding through the Michigan Great Lakes Protection Fund to issue this RFP in January of 2021. Obviously, that has to go through the exemption request process internally for Eagle and be supported through the budget process. So this is one of those recommendations where there's the potential that funding, wouldn't necessarily need to be provided through a legislative ask. But from my perspective, I think having the recommendation incorporated into the legislative report not only speaks to the general support by the Water Use Advisory Council, but the department as well, that this is a high priority. So I would recommend that this is something that we would still want to include in the report, even though it's not a legislative ask for funding. So with that, I'll open it up if any of my other committee members have anything else that they want to add, or Pat, if there's anything that you want to add that I may have missed, and then turn it back over to Laura or Brian.
I think you did great, Emily. I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Indeed, I think it sounds pretty good, and it's always wonderful when you come with a source of predicted funding.
I try to do what I can.
That is a really good way to package a recommendation, Emily. Okay, let's take a couple questions on this before actually moving on to the water conservation side. I see Doug, you have your hand up. Doug Needham.
Yeah, just a question, Emily. So if the, I guess the Michigan Great Lakes Protection Fund couldn't fund this, would it still be would that then be an ask for the legislature to provide funding?
It could be. I have some other thoughts about some potential partners, including Michigan Sea Grant. While they focus primarily on coastal, some of their mission does focus on water quantity issues around the coast and sustainable water use. So they're getting ready. Actually, I sit on their advisory board, but they are in the process of soliciting potential projects for sponsorship. I don't know if this one, would ultimately make it through their selection process. So I think there's a really good likelihood that we'll, I know what budget we have at least currently in the protection fund. I think there's a good likelihood that we could fund it through the protection fund this next year. Would this rise at the top of the Water Use Advisory Council's priorities for legislative funding asks? That might not. I mean, there's only so much money to go around. So I'm not sure if this would compete all the way to the top, but I certainly think it's really important. I think our committee is really supportive of this. And there's certainly some other pathways we could look at for some funding to support it. If we didn't have the full $250,000 available in the protection fund in FY 2021, we could split the funding over 2 years. I envision this as a multi-year project anyway. So it's easier to come up with $125,000, through the fund if that's needed.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Doug. I have a question. Next up is Buddy Sebastian, and then I'll go to Tammy Newcomb after that.
I just have one question. I thought this is great, to be honest with you. I think it's a great idea, but I'm a little confused just on one thing. I thought it was the Eagle's responsibility when there was an ARE to convene the first water users group, according to statute.
Right, and that is correct. What we're proposing is that even Eagle will need to have a clearly defined process, a collaborative decision-making process. And so having a good understanding for the department, this user's manual also helps equip the department and the program with the kinds of effective process facilitation strategies to help the group come to consensus. So it has multiple benefits in that it's not just for the committees to use on their own, but the manual will lay out the steps for the department too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Tammy?
Yeah, so thanks, Brian. I just wanted to say I'm also on that Sea Grant Steering Advisory Committee and would be happy to help support this in that process as well, Emily.
Great. Thanks, Tammy. I owe Catherine Rising an email back. So if you want to be part of that conversation, I'm happy to schedule it around our availability.
Whatever's helpful to you.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
All right. Anybody else have any questions? I don't see any other hands raised. All right. Then I'm going to, since we're on this topic, I'm not seeing anybody else. I'm going to ask, does this recommendation have comfort for consensus approval now, or does anybody have any issues or concerns that they'd like to pull this out for some further development prior to the next meeting? If you do have any concerns, in about 5 or 10 seconds to speak up, raise a hand, yell something. Okay, I do not see any, so we will mark this as good to go for now. So thank you very much, Emily, and everybody who worked on that.
Thanks.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the Water Conservation Work Group. And Kelly, will it be you presenting today or somebody else?
Yep, it'll be me. Thanks, Brian. I'll apologize in advance. I know my internet is not very good. I think the first slide, just because my stuff is way behind what you see, really shows a couple of recommendations that actually, if you want to move to the next slide, that would be helpful. So 45. Thank you. We didn't get the memo about the form is actually meeting next week or shortly thereafter to finalize recommendations to you at the last meeting. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of them. Jim Milnes did contact me, and we are adding Andy LeBaron to our next meeting so that we've got some more input on some of the and Eagle are either working on some of these right now or could be the agencies that would handle these situations. So I feel confident that we've got the right people on the bus, and the next meeting will definitely have those recommendations laid out. Basically, we're looking at 3 recommendations to move forward, and all we did is take a look at the last Water Advisory Council's recommendations, and we cross-tabulated them with the Michigan Water Strategy, and then we put them through a matrix process by effort and impact so that we could really see what those priority recommendations that we wanted to make sure didn't kind of fall off the radar when it came to this topic. So there were 2 recommendations scores. And one is taking the past Water Use Advisory Council's recommendation 1.2 and matching that up with the Michigan Water Strategy Goal 5 recommendation 2, which really talks about taking those GAMPs for agricultural irrigators and putting them into a plan with MSU Extension to really continue to provide and expand training and outreach, not just to the irrigation sector, but to other groups as well. From my understanding, this is something that they've already been working on, but we'd like to continue to receive information about the status and the progress of this recommendation. The next recommendation comes from the Water Use Council's 1.3 and Water Strategy 4, which really talks about incentivizing public water conservation measures. We feel this would provide it would help to reduce the cost of water loss and really all of those homeowners and individuals that also have an impact on water in Michigan continue to provide the best conservation practices that they can. The last recommendation that we'll end up putting forward takes a look at a previous recommendation, 2.2, and combining that with the Michigan Water Strategy Goal number 5, recommendation 6, and all of the subsequent recommendations that are underneath that. So there are 4 recommendations that kind of lump together in this group, and we'd like to determine how these recommendations, we'd like to see them to be accomplished, but this is work, just understanding that there's a lot of concern about the financial impact that this could have to local governments. I'm not really sure that this one is going to rank very high in the big scheme of things, just knowing the financial considerations that we'd already be asking for, and that we would get a lot more return on our investment with those from previous committees. So if there are no questions, or if there are, or if other committee members would like to jump in.
Any other committee members want to add anything before I go to some questions? Okay. Let's take a couple questions then. I see John Yelich has one first, and then I see Tom Zimnicki after that, possibly. Go ahead,
Okay.
John.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Great job, you and the team. One of the things that I didn't hear, and this is from discussions, and I know Pat's on the call right now too, is that one of the issues that we have is we have private conservation, but we also have, particularly in the growth areas, you have land developers that don't seem to care. And somehow there has to be a message given that we educate them that they need to care about water conservation when they're doing their developments. And that's both in their design plans and other things. And having worked in Arizona for a number of years, as well as other drought areas, xeriscaping is not ugly. You can make it pretty. But anyway, we just don't seem to grasp that here in Michigan. And that's what we need to do, particularly in those areas that have a potential of having low water availability, particularly for the private citizen.
Good
Thanks,
points,
John. I have taken note of that. We'll definitely add that into our conversation.
Very good. Tom Zimnicki.
Hey, appreciate it, Kelly. For on slide 45, the 1.3 recommendation. So is the thinking there like around, are you guys thinking like around the SRF program? What are we talking about when we talk about, because that, to me, that reads like getting more points around like water infrastructure projects around like the SRF fund or other things. So I'm wondering like what infrastructure projects are you talking about, and like kind of more what the thinking is there.
Thanks for that question, Tom. I don't know what that. It's a little bit of a difficult question for me to answer. We have not had the opportunity to dig deep into these. A couple of times, and so we just pulled out the topics that were previously recommended, and then we're going back and really digging into these, basically these three. So we have to go back and see the previous recommendations and if they lay anything out, but I'm not sure that that's been defined. So that's a great question.
Kelly, this is Laura. I'm sorry, you cut out for a minute there. Could you repeat that?
Yes. We have to go back and take a look at the previous recommendation. Like, these are just pieces of them. So we need to go and dig more into what was provided before I'd actually be able to answer that question.
Okay. Yeah, I think yeah, more detail on that would be appreciated. I think certainly at this point, without better understanding what type of infrastructure you're talking about, and certainly since it reads kind of like it gets into the SRF loan program, like that's would be a concern for us at this point to be putting forward recommendations through this avenue around SRF reform, if that is kind of the infrastructure that you're talking about in this bullet.
Oh, thanks for that, Tom.
Yep.
Go ahead, Emily.
Just want to make sure I took my hand down. So I think what we talked about in our last committee, because our committee came together in July, so obviously not a lot of time for us to develop new recommendations. One of the things that we discussed at our last meeting was that what we may end up putting forward is a recommendation that a small list of recommendations needs to be further explored in sort of the next 2 years worth of work by the Water Use Advisory Council, because there's not a lot of time this fall and in this stage of the process for us to go deep on specific recommendations. So it's either going to be a really short list of 1 or 2 things, or it's going to be kind of punting to another group or a larger group to actually start to flesh out what those would look like. So Tom, I don't think we're going to be making recommendations for policy changes to SRF.
Okay. Yeah. You can
rest assured. I don't feel comfortable with that either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Hey, I see Pat, you have your hand up too. Go ahead, Pat.
Sure, that recommendation was based on the 2014 work, and that was really a way for try to incentivize municipalities to embrace conservation with the carrot of maybe earning some more project points for the SRF. So it was SRF related, but that more work would need to be done before that's fleshed out.
All right, since these aren't quite ready for prime time and checking on consensus, I'll just make the note that if any of you listening today, this does pique your interest, whether positively you want to contribute something or you have concerns, questions, like we've heard a little bit about, just make sure that you please reach out to somebody on that committee, right away, so that time is of the essence before our next meeting, and try to get your thoughts or concerns in while they're working to develop out the recommendations that they want to bring to us next month. Okay. All right. Is Kelly, anything else?
Nope, that does it for me, Brian. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Okay, so that brings us to implementing strategies committee. Doug and Laura, which one of you will walk us through this?
I'll take the start, Brian. Thanks. So really what we've been waiting for is this Water Use Advisory Council meeting, because we now have a whole host of recommendations that we have a subcommittee meeting on Friday where we're going to start piling through all of these, looking at past recommendations as well as kind of the list that we looked at, as well as this new one, and try to put it in some type of a semblance where we can help put priorities to what has been requested. The thought is we're going to put them in some type of format and listing and bring it to the full council for your approval and blessing and or thoughts and comments and reshuffling before the final report is drafted. So I think our work is truly going to begin really heavily on Friday.
Anything else that you want to add? Any other thoughts? You'll just be coming back to us after you get to work now?
Yep, that's it at this point. I know we've got meetings and maybe we can do some email stuff in between to try to get some discussion going, but we need to have a first blush at, okay, now that we've actually seen these, and start putting them into a format.
I guess I'll add too, because this is kind of a good place to jump back to it, realizing that I blew right past these slides in the beginning of the meeting. Just basically kind of trying to reiterate here, as we're working on coordinating strategies and figuring out kind of, how does this report go together? How do we present this as a cohesive body to the legislature? Remembering that we want to not make this, hey, this subcommittee did that, that subcommittee did this. It's going to be the council recommends these things. We're really going to be leaning on you guys and coming back to you for recommendations on what, on, hey, what's your top priority? Which of your children do you like best? And going after those goals of making sure that this report is concise, that it's easy to understand, that the legislature can read it and get a clear idea of this is what we're asking for, recognizing that everybody comes to the legislature begging for money. So, these are the things that we want to get done. These are the things that have to get done first. That we're going to be talking about implementing the strategy, funding recommendations. Luckily, it looks like, at least for this go around, we're not going to be asking for a whole lot in the way of legislative changes, but just keeping them abreast of, here's the work that's already going on, here's what we recommend, here's what we need to be able to get this done in the time frames. So we really appreciate the work that you guys have been putting in to make that happen and to help make that clear. So we're going to be working with you guys a lot to try to come back to the next couple of meetings with draft materials and sort of, you know, a cohesive report for everybody to take a look at and put their red pen to.
All right. Doug and Laura, thank you, and thanks in advance to your committee. I know I'm sure you would have preferred a bunch of these committees to trickle things to you earlier than now, rather than a giant dump right at the end. But thank you for your work in advance, and apologies for kind of all committees dumping things on you at the end.
We live for data dumps.
No, we've got a lot of notes right now, so we're really set good for where we need to be.
It does look like you maybe got a couple of questions though before you move on there, Brian.
Yes, I was going to say I have a couple of hands raised, so before you guys skip away, let me get to those. First off, Frank Edwagishik.
Yes, I have there's a concern that I have that I wants to make sure that into our final report, and I don't know if it's in part of any of the individual recommendations, but it's the idea that we need to, part of what we're doing with this is because of the need to respect water. And I've said this in other meetings before, and the idea that John Yelich touched on it because of his work in drier climates, the idea that even in abundance, we need to respect the water. And often this has more of an attitudinal issue to it. So I think that this might belong in a preamble to our statement or somewhere where we talk about the fact of how important water is to life, and that these recommendations are things that are helping us to implement ways to work with the water and to protect and conserve water. But there's a fundamental importance to it that is overarching in all of the things that we're working on. And I just wanted to raise that now, and particularly during this implementation strategies committee, and perhaps when we start thinking about the full structure of this report, that be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, and we may reach out to you for some help making sure we get it right. Emily.
I completely agree with Frank. I appreciate your comments on that. I just had kind of a procedural question then. So for those of us who are with the committees where we don't need to have further discussion on our recommendations, are you just accepting the write-ups that we have now? Should we expect that you're going to come back and ask us to reformat or make any editorial changes to that? What's the next step for us, just so we can anticipate and be responsive in the time that you need?
Yeah, thank you. Here's what I would say. I appreciate everybody, from the committee members to all of the regular members, taking a look at a bunch of brand new recommendations in like the last week or less than a week over email, and really helping us to clear the deck of as many of them that are ready and had everybody's consensus, and we've been able to put flags next to the ones that need a little bit more work. For those, we will work. We, the co-chairs, the executive team, will work with some of the committee members and chairs to try to work through more discussions and resolution of the ones that had issues. For the other ones, for right now, you could probably take a breather and say that your work is temporarily done, and know that when we get into the collection of the reporting, there'll be a bunch of discussions about how to lump, how to separate, how to characterize them, group them, all of that type of stuff. So don't think you're off the hook completely, but I would say wait a little bit until we start trying to figure out how we want to put them all together, and then we may need help with wordsmithing. There may be drafters who take stabs at it and then say, hey, this was yours, make sure that I did not substantively change anything that we shouldn't have. But you could probably take a breather if you're you are in the group of people who got theirs cleared. So you could take a temporary breather, and then I would say by October, November, we'll probably have to be back in touch for reporting and to participate with, the effort to make sure things are prioritized. And Doug, go ahead.
So the one thing, I guess, the new topics committee, so the water user conservation group is going to have 3 recommendations. So I think that's probably the only one that I looked at kind of as we went through, is a little more in-depth detail on what those are with cost. So, I kind of made notes of agricultural irrigators getting in touch with the MSU extension, incentive water use conservation measures, and then that grouping of past recommendations. The connection was going in and out, so it was really hard to hear what that topic may be. But if that could be followed, I think the rest are pretty good at this point. They're pretty in-depth and detailed.
Yeah. So yeah, I will summarize and say that, you can expect an email. All council members can probably expect a couple emails from us as follow-up as we help to coordinate some of the work that needs to be done. The October meeting is where we will really need to strive to get final consensus on anything that we are going to be able to achieve consensus on. And then from there, we will, be diving into reporting, formatting, priorities. So more to come, but it was important now that we get as much substance that we're in agreement on out. I will roll thank you, Jim, you are a wonderful slide advancer today. Thank you. So we have a next meeting scheduled October 20th. As I mentioned, that one's going to be our finish up on striving for consensus. We will probably start hearing back more and more from the Implementing Strategies Committee on other considerations. And we would like, and we are proposing, and there can be discussion on this, but we are proposing to have an additional meeting on November 10th. We see that with the reporting and prioritizations, that it is necessary to have an additional one to make sure that we are completed with all assignments by our deadline. Is there any discussion or objections, any difference of opinion on the need to have an additional one on November 10th? If you do have an objection or any other viewpoint on it, go ahead and raise your hand. Okay. We won't make them longer than they need to be, but thank you. We'd like to have them there to make sure that we can get through our work. So please take note, October 20th, November 10th, and December 15th will be the next 3 meetings. Okay. All right. So that should bring us to open comments.
This is Frank Edwagishik. I just wanted to make sure the time on that new meeting would be the same, 1 to 4.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Frank. Thank you. And I should have checked there. I saw a couple people's videos starting to freeze up, which can often mean that's mine. Did everybody clearly hear what I said on that last section? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Doug. I can see Doug giving me the thumbs up. All right. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So this would be our opportunity for some open comments. Go ahead. If you can raise your hand button, that is great. If you can't, go ahead and jump in, and we have a couple minutes for some open comments if anybody has that. All right. I was going to say, boy, we might have exhausted everybody, but we have John Yelich. Go ahead, John.
I just want to share the fact that we are getting factual data right now with this drill rig right out my window here. And I have another drill rig showing up tomorrow, so it's going to be pretty busy down here in Cass County for a week and a half.
Thank you. All right. Anybody
Brian,
else? Yeah, please, Laura, go ahead.
I just wanted to pose this question, and I'm not expecting necessarily an answer today, but just something for everybody to start thinking about, and particularly hopefully our resources with Eagle. And that is considering our report to the legislature. Timing for that, making sure that we're able to get on the schedules of those committees. I know sometimes that stuff has to be scheduled fairly far in advance. I'm looking for some guidance and for some advice, and what do we need to do versus what do you guys need to do to make sure that that happens and we're able to actually make our report to the legislature as the statute requires. So again, no need for an answer today because I'm sure that's that's a huge box of stuff to unpack, but I want to put it on people's radar.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I mean, certainly we need to kind of submit it by the timeline in electronic format, but of course, by the time we can do presentations, there will be different people that we need to schedule that with than are present today to schedule it with, given an election. So leadership changes. So yes, we have a lot to kind of figure out post-report. Thank you. Anybody else? We went to 3 hours instead of 2, and here we are. I mean, we might make it ahead of time. I'll let you out early, but if anybody has something, you go ahead. Going once, going twice. All right. I want to say thank you very much to each and every one of you. From everybody who participated in committees and is getting this stuff out under the gun. And for everybody who's working very hard here to reach consensus, I don't take that lightly. And I was very impressed by everybody, both the products and the agreement here. So thank you very much. It's a lot goes into it. With that, I'm going to just go ahead and say we are going to adjourn unless there is an objection by anybody raised. Going once, twice. Meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you all. Be well, and we will be in communication, at least electronically, very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.